Behind the blue curtain of The Tonight Show, America's safest bedtime ritual chaos was quietly getting high. Drunk legends, stoned geniuses, and chemically courageous stars stumbled toward Johnny Carson's desk while he smiled, improvised, and babysat them on live TV. Welcome to late-night television slightly altered. 1. For 3 decades, The Tonight Show was America's nightly lullaby. At 11:30 p.m., the blue curtain parted, the band played on cue, and viewers settled in, knowing exactly what they were getting: a smooth monologue, polite laughter, and Johnny Carson, calm, clever, and reassuring as a glass of warm milk. Live television had never looked safer. That was the illusion. Behind the curtain was a different show entirely. Movie stars sweating through their makeup, comedy legends relaxed beyond federal guidelines, cultural icons waiting backstage while reality drifted just slightly out of focus. While America brushed its teeth, Carson prepared to interview people who probably shouldn't have been trusted with car keys, let alone a microphone. Johnny didn't need breathalyzers or lab tests. He had instincts. One glance told him everything. A subtle tug on the tie meant trouble. Straightening his cue cards twice was a silent alarm to the control room. Keep the shots wide. Keep the questions simple and pray. Producers hovered. Assistants panicked. Executives pretended not to notice. And Carson. He smiled and made it look effortless. This was the unspoken secret of late night's most powerful desk. Beneath the polished jokes and flawless timing was controlled chaos. A live nightly balancing act between professionalism and the wild, chemically adventurous spirit of the 1970s. And at the center of it all sat Johnny Carson, tasked with doing the impossible, making absolute madness look like perfectly normal television. 2. The most dangerous place on The Tonight Show wasn't the stage. It was the green room. A modest couch, neutral walls, and a bar stocked like a 5-star hotel for people who were already nervous wrecks. This was where careers were made or chemically negotiated. Guests didn't pace that room because they were bored. They paced because they were terrified. Sitting across from Johnny Carson wasn't a chat, it was a televised judgment day. One great appearance could launch a career. One bad one could haunt you longer than an ex with receipts. And unlike modern talk shows, Carson didn't do rehearsed banter. He wanted spontaneity, authenticity, panic. So guests self-medicated. Officially, the rule was simple. 1 drink was fine, 2 was risky. Unofficially, good luck telling an Oscar winner no. The Green Room Bar was legendary, top shelf, only personally approved by Carson. Add a pocket full of pills, a little weed from a helpful assistant. Maybe something powdered if it was Studio 54 o'clock somewhere, and suddenly courage felt achievable. The 1970s didn't help. Cocaine was basically a food group. Rock stars lived like emperors. Wall Street snorted through lunch. Hollywood brought all of it to Burbank. The Tonight Show didn't exist outside culture, it absorbed it. Carson understood. He wasn't the morality police. He was a traffic controller. A little buzz, fine. Totally altered, manageable. Non-functional now. We have a problem. And somewhere in that green room, as the clock ticked toward airtime, America's biggest stars took one last sip, sniff, or puff, then walked toward the most unforgiving desk on television. 3. George Carlin. George Carlin didn't walk onto The Tonight Show in the early 70s, so much as drift onto it, grinning sharp-eyed, and very obviously not sober. By then, the clean-cut comic was gone, replaced by a long-haired counterculture philosopher who looked like he'd just stepped out of a cloud of weed and straight into television history. And no one, least of all Johnny Carson, pretended not to notice. Carlin wasn't hiding anything. That faintly glazed stare, practically part of the act. A camera operator once joked that George riffed like a genius and smiled like a stoner, and that summed it up perfectly. He wasn't sloppy. He wasn't lost. He was elevated. Carlin showed up high, sat down, and proceeded to be smarter, funnier, and more dangerous than most comedians were, stone-cold sober. Carson loved him, booked him more than 130 times, but never let him guest host. Not because Carlin lacked talent, but because reliability matters when you're running live television for 90 minutes. George was brilliant, but predictable. Not so much. He was what the staff called a functional herbalist. The weed didn't dull him. It tuned him to a different frequency. Johnny adapted accordingly. No tight setups, no narrow questions. He'd toss Carlin a topic and lean back like a man releasing a hawk. What followed were glorious free-form monologues, part stand-up, part sermon, part cosmic rant that defined a generation. Carlin later confirmed what everyone already knew. Yes, he was usually stoned. It was the 70s. He was George Carlin. Do the math. In Carson's universe, that was perfectly acceptable. High, yes. Impaired, no. And as long as Carlin delivered genius, Johnny let him fly. 4. Cheech Marin and Tommy Chong. Cheech Marin and Tommy Chong didn't just arrive on The Tonight Show high, they arrived on brand. There was no mystery, no denial, no awkward backstage whispers. If other guests treated substances like a nervous secret, Cheech and Chong treated them like a press release. Everyone knew the deal. The audience knew. The crew knew. Johnny Carson definitely knew. These weren't sober men pretending to be stoned for comedy. This was where their brains lived. One producer joked that booking them was less like inviting guests and more like opening a window and letting the 1970s wander in. What made their appearances work wasn't damage control, it was choreography. Carson didn't try to steer them back to reality. He planted himself firmly outside of it. Johnny played the straight, slightly baffled square, asking innocent questions that sailed right past Cheech and Chong and landed somewhere deep in the cannabis cosmos. And that contrast, comedy gold. When Chong drifted into rambling stories that never found a point, Carson didn't rescue him. He let the silence breathe, raised an eyebrow at the camera, and allowed the audience to catch up to the joke. Yes, they are exactly this high. The laughs weren't at their expense, they were part of the shared understanding. There was real respect there. Carson appreciated their honesty. They appreciated that he didn't sanitize them. No fake outrage, no forced normalcy. Just two unapologetically stoned comedians and a host smart enough to let authenticity do the work. With Cheech and Chong making the guest look good meant letting them be gloriously openly themselves. No babysitting required. No emergency signals. Just weed timing and a desk sturdy enough to anchor reality while everything else floated happily away. 5. Richard Pryor. Richard Pryor is never just a guest on The Tonight Show. He was a live wire taped to a microphone, brilliant, dangerous, and occasionally one bad decision away from short-circuiting on national television. When Pryor walked out, the audience leaned forward. When Carson smiled politely, the control room held its breath. At his best, Richard Pryor was untouchable. Raw, fearless, painfully honest. He could turn childhood trauma into comedy gold in a single sentence. But substances, especially cocaine, added an unpredictable multiplier. One minute he was destroying the room with precision jokes. The next his eyes would drift, his thoughts would scatter, and the punchline would wander off without him. Crew members described it like watching a rocket lose guidance mid-flight. Pryor would start a story clean and sharp, then suddenly veer into cosmic territory, chasing an idea only he could see. The audience laughed sometimes because it was funny, sometimes because they weren't sure what else to do. Carson always knew the difference. This is where Johnny became a master traffic cop. When Richard was flying, Johnny let him soar. When things got wobbly, Carson jumped in with a quick question, a joke, a perfectly timed commercial break, anything to keep Pryor from crashing in front of millions. It was crisis management disguised as casual banter. Unlike other hosts who might have gone for cheap laughs, Carson protected Pryor. He respected the genius and worried about the man. Off camera, he checked in. On camera, he built safety nets out of charm and timing. Pryor wasn't sloppy, he was volatile, and volatility in Carson's hands became riveting television instead of public humiliation. With Richard Pryor, every appearance was a gamble. Sometimes it paid off in legendary comedy. Sometimes Johnny quietly saved the show. Either way, you were watching something rare genius dancing on the edge with Carson, making sure it didn't fall off. 6. Truman Capote. Truman Capote was supposed to be a class act, a literary jewel, razor wit, southern charm, and a voice sharp enough to slice martinis in half. Which is why his 1980 appearance on The Tonight Show landed not as edgy television, but as a slow-motion emergency. From the moment Capote shuffled onto the stage, something was wrong. Not quirky wrong, not eccentric wrong. Wrong. Words slid together. His head dipped forward like it was being gently powered down, then snapped back up with the startled look of a man who just remembered he was on television. The audience chuckled nervously. The control room panicked professionally. This was not George Carlin drifting. This was not Richard Pryor wobbling. This was a man losing a wrestling match with gravity. Johnny Carson tried. Oh, how he tried. Questions were simplified to near yes or no territory. Smiles tightened. Reaction shots became the safest footage in the building. At one point, the cameras seemed to linger on Johnny not because he was funny, but because he was functional. It was the television equivalent of focus on the adult in the room. Backstage executives hovered like air traffic controllers watching a plane come in sideways. Capote was slurring badly, nodding off mid-thought, then resurfacing with fragments of sentences that went nowhere and meant nothing. This wasn't daring. It wasn't counterculture. It was unwatchable. The moment they cut to commercial, Carson's famous calm evaporated. Never again, he reportedly told the staff. And he meant it. What angered him wasn't the substances, it was the disrespect. Carson could tolerate altered. He could not tolerate absent. Truman Capote became one of the few guests ever quietly permanently banned. No scandal, no announcement, just a line drawn in the sand. On The Tonight Show, you could be high weird or wild. But if you couldn't show up, Johnny Carson would make sure you never showed up again. 7. Sammy Davis Jr. Sammy Davis Jr. didn't stumble onto The Tonight Show, he detonated onto it. When Sammy sat down in 1974, the studio didn't just light up, it vibrated. He talked faster than the band could think, bounced in his chair like it owed him money, and radiated enough energy to power Burbank through a blackout. To the audience, it looked like peak Sammy charm, swagger talent turned up to 11. Backstage, a different story. Crew members exchanged looks. Sound techs noticed the sweat. Producers clocked the pacing. The green room bathroom had reportedly been occupied a little too long. No one said the word out loud, but everyone was thinking it. This wasn't just enthusiasm, this was turbocharged. Sammy fired off stories like a machine gun with jazz hands. He interrupted himself to start new thoughts. Finished other people's sentences. barely sat still long enough to register Johnny Carson's questions. And Johnny, cool as ever, adjusted instantly. He didn't slow Sammy down. He surfaced him. Let the momentum roll, nudged it back on track when needed, and made sure the whole thing looked intentional. That was the difference. Unlike other guests who drifted or derailed, Sammy remained a professional to the bone. Whatever was fueling the engine, he never lost control of the car. He hit his marks, landed laughs, and delivered exactly what America tuned in for, just with extra voltage. Carson never called it out. Not on air, not backstage. Just wiped his brow during a commercial break and joked that he'd gotten second-hand exhaustion. That was Johnny's way. Sammy Davis Jr. represented a rare category, chemically assisted maybe, but never compromised. High energy, high risk, high reward. He didn't cross the line, he tap danced on it, and somehow flawlessly stuck the landing. 8. Peter Fonda. Peter Fonda didn't just sit down on The Tonight Show in 1970, he arrived on a different plane of existence. This wasn't a man who'd had a few drinks. This was a man who appeared to be negotiating with time itself. From the moment Fonda walked out, the warning lights were flashing. His pupils were enormous. His gaze wandered from Johnny Carson to the studio lights to his own hands, as if all three had suddenly become deeply philosophical. When Carson asked a question, Fonda listened patiently, then answered a completely different one from 30 seconds earlier. Staff suspected LSD strongly. The interview began innocently enough, but it unraveled fast. Asked about upcoming projects, a softball even by Tonight Show standards. Fonda launched into a meditation on non-linear time, cosmic waves, and how consciousness wraps around humanity like a blanket. Somewhere in the middle of it, reality quietly excused itself. Carson knew immediately. This wasn't a situation to play for laughs. This was damage control at warp speed. Questions became painfully simple. Smiles stayed polite. And when Fonda drifted too far into the astral plane, Johnny gave the signal 2 taps on the cue cards. Translation: abort mission. 5 minutes in the interview was over. When the show returned from commercial, Fonda was gone. No explanation, no joke. Just Johnny Carson back at his desk, acting like nothing unusual had occurred, which somehow made it even funnier. What's remarkable is what didn't happen next. Carson wasn't angry. He wasn't judgmental. He shrugged it off. Everyone has off nights, he reportedly said. Fonda was invited back later and behaved like a human being. The incident became legend proof that in the 1970s, you could show up tripping through space-time, derail a talk show, and still get another shot. As long as Johnny Carson was there to quietly pull the emergency brake before the universe completely dissolved on live television. 9. Oliver Reed. Oliver Reed didn't arrive on The Tonight Show. Altered, he arrived armed. Armed with booze volume and the kind of unpredictability that makes insurance adjusters sweat. If most chemically enhanced guests required gentle steering, Reed required crowd control. From the start, something felt off. Slurred words turned into shouted interruptions. Amused chuckles curdled into nervous laughter. Johnny Carson's face, normally a masterclass in relaxed charm, shifted subtly from entertainer to risk assessor. This wasn't a tipsy actor oversharing. This was a man auditioning for a bar fight on network television. Reed grew louder. He talked over Carson. He veered into non sequiturs with the confidence of someone who'd lost the map and burned the compass. Then came the moment that froze the room. Reed stood up, unannounced, uninvited, demonstrating what appeared to be a fighting stance, as if The Tonight Show had suddenly become a pub in Manchester at closing time. Backstage security moved closer. Cameras tightened. Carson stopped playing along. Johnny's approach flipped instantly. No indulgence. No playful redirects. He cut Reed off, reasserted control, and shortened the segment with surgical precision. This wasn't about comedy anymore, it was about containment. Carson could handle stoned. He could handle drunk. He could not handle threatening. After the show, there was no debate. Oliver Reed would not be coming back. Star power didn't matter. British legend didn't matter. Once a guest crossed into aggression, Carson's famous tolerance vanished. Reed joined an exclusive list, permanently banned. His appearance became a cautionary tale, whispered through NBC hallways, a reminder that while altered states might make for great television, hostility never does. On Johnny Carson's stage, you could be high weird or wildly inappropriate. But the moment you scared the room, the desk was no longer yours. 10. Hunter S. Thompson. If other guests showed up, altered. Hunter S. Thompson arrived armed with philosophy paranoia and a bloodstream that looked like a pharmacy receipt. When the creator of gonzo journalism sat down on The Tonight Show, it was immediately clear this would not be a normal interview, mostly because Thompson had never lived a normal moment in his life. By the time he appeared opposite Johnny Carson in the mid-1970s, Thompson was already a walking myth. Aviator sunglasses indoors, cigarette permanently lit, a voice that sounded like it had been sandblasted by bourbon and bad decisions. Whatever chemicals were in his system, they weren't there to relax him. They were there to accelerate the truth. Thompson didn't answer questions so much as ambush them. Carson would ask about writing, and Hunter would veer into political rage, cultural decay, or vague references to enemies who may or may not have been real. The audience laughed, unsure whether they were witnessing satire prophecy or a man actively arguing with invisible forces. Johnny, to his credit, didn't try to rein him in. You don't steer a hurricane, you frame it. Carson let Thompson rant occasionally, interjecting with a dry, surgical one-liner that grounded the madness just enough to keep it watchable. The contrast was Electric Network Television's calmest man hosting its most combustible guest. Backstage staff whispered about how wired Thompson seemed. Was it alcohol, amphetamines, everything? The answer was irrelevant. Hunter remained coherent, aggressive, and fully himself. This wasn't impairment, it was weaponized consciousness. Carson never banned him, never scolded him. He understood the category immediately. Hunter S. Thompson wasn't there to be likable. He was there to detonate ideas on live television. And as long as the explosion stayed verbal, Johnny Carson let the fuse burn. 11. Orson Welles. When Orson Welles sat down on The Tonight Show, you didn't know whether you were about to witness brilliance or a slow-moving train loaded with Shakespeare wine and wounded pride. Sometimes it was both. By the 1970s, Welles was already a legend weighed down by his own mythology. Citizen Kane had made him immortal. Hollywood had made him bitter. Alcohol made him honest, dangerously honest. He arrived on Carson's set, not sloppy, not incoherent, but generously lubricated enough to treat live television like a private salon. Welles spoke in paragraphs, long ones. Sentences looped, detoured, and occasionally forgot where they started. He quoted himself. He corrected Carson politely, but firmly. He drifted from anecdotes about filmmaking into grudges with studio's critics and time itself. The wine hadn't dulled his mind. It had removed the brakes. Johnny recognized the type instantly. This wasn't a guest to interrupt. This was a guest to pace. Carson leaned back, nodded, and let Welles perform, occasionally slipping in a dry, surgical quip that reminded the audience this was still a talk show, not a one-man Broadway monologue. Crew members noticed the signs. the flushed face, the expansive gestures, the way Wells's confidence grew with every sentence. But unlike Capote, unlike Reed, Wells never crossed into chaos. He remained articulate, commanding, and mesmerizing, just slightly drunk on both alcohol and his own legend. Carson never cut him short, never scolded him. He understood the equation: a tipsy genius was still a genius. The audience wasn't watching for order. They were watching Orson Welles being Orson Welles. In Carson's unwritten rulebook, Welles fit perfectly. Altered, yes. Impaired, self-indulgent, absolutely. But as long as the words kept flowing and the mind stayed sharp, Johnny let the Titan talk, glass raised, ego intact, and mythology very much alive on live television. 12. Robin Williams. When Robin Williams sat down on The Tonight Show, the chair barely survived. This wasn't an interview, it was a controlled explosion. Williams didn't answer questions. He attacked them, leaping from voices to characters to accents with the speed of a man whose brain had no concept of breaks. By the late 1970s and early 80s, everyone in show business knew the rumors. Cocaine was everywhere, and Robin's manic energy sometimes felt less like caffeine and more like rocket fuel. He talked fast, moved faster, and generated more material in 30 seconds than most comics did in a full set. The audience roared. The band struggled to keep up. The cameras prayed. Johnny Carson, who had discovered Williams years earlier, understood exactly what he was dealing with. This wasn't impairment, it was overload. Robin was coherent, brilliant, and absolutely unstoppable. Carson didn't try to slow him down. He played traffic cone, not speed bump, raising a finger just long enough to redirect the chaos before it smashed through the set. Crew members joked that interviewing Robin was like holding the door open during a hurricane. He climbed on furniture. He impersonated animals. He interrupted himself mid-sentence to finish a joke that hadn't been told yet. And somehow it all worked. Unlike guests who drifted or unraveled, Williams always landed the plane even if it came in sideways and on fire. Whatever chemicals were involved, the professionalism never disappeared. He knew where the laughs were. He knew where the camera was. And most importantly, he knew when Johnny had saved him from going too far. Carson adored him. He didn't judge. He didn't warn. He simply adapted, letting Robin burn as bright as possible without incinerating live television. In Johnny's unwritten rulebook, Robin Williams was the ultimate exception, overwhelming, exhausting, possibly chemically enhanced, but so undeniably gifted that the madness became magic. 13. Joan Rivers. When Joan Rivers walked onto The Tonight Show, she didn't look dangerous. No slurred words, no wild eyes, no cosmic rambling. That's what made her case unsettling. Joan wasn't obviously high, she was chemically held together. By the 1970s, Rivers was one of the sharpest tongues in comedy, a machine gun delivery wrapped around brutal honesty. But backstage staff whispered about the pills. Uppers to perform, downers to survive, anxiety medications to keep the fear from swallowing her whole. Joan didn't use substances to float, she used them to function. Sitting across from Johnny Carson was not easy for her. He had discovered her, championed her, then quietly kept her at arm's length. Every appearance felt like an audition that never ended. That pressure showed. Rivers talked fast, too fast. Jokes stacked on top of jokes like she was afraid silence might kill her. Carson noticed everything. If Joan seemed jittery, he slowed the pace. If she spiraled into self-deprecation, he redirected. This wasn't babysitting, it was emotional air traffic control. Johnny understood that Rivers wasn't out of control. She was terrified of losing control. Crew members later recalled how tightly wound she was before airtime. Hands shaking, rapid breathing, a quick pill dry swallowed before makeup touch-ups. Once the red light went on, though, she was lethal. Precision jokes, ruthless timing, zero mercy. Unlike Capote or Reed, Joan never crossed the line. She respected the desk, respected the audience. But her appearances revealed a quieter truth about the era. Not all chemical assistants made people wild. Some kept them upright. 14. This was never really about drugs. It was about Johnny Carson. Night after night on The Tonight Show, Carson managed chaos without preaching, protected guests without embarrassing them, and drew one simple line: be entertaining or be gone. High was acceptable. Dangerous wasn't. In an era before social media outrage, Carson decided how moments lived or disappeared. His genius wasn't control through force, but through calm. And that's why even when everything else was a little altered, Johnny Carson never was. Carson never was. Carson never was. Carson never was.